Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today, I'm going to survey the desolation, which is current science fiction and fantasy storytelling. And I'm not going to do it by some high-minded philosophical origins. I'm going to do it by looking at a lot of everyday things and things that I've run across within the research for my channel and going over mostly the comic industry, but some other industries as well. But I think this desolation of science fiction and fantasy storytelling holds for every other industry as well. Because I think comics, in a creative manner, encapsulate a lot of other kinds of storytelling. Because whereas with novels, you have simply the word on the page, you have that word on the page with comics, but you have more. You also have a visual. And just like for most television and movies, you're going to have a storyboard for your story. Within comics, you have that storyboard. It is the visual for your medium. So I think comics is a really good medium to look at for storytelling for science fiction and fantasy, and also because there's really good information about how comics have gone wrong substantially within the last 10 years. I guess I should say especially within the last 10 years. But before I get there, I just want to let everyone know that my graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, is still available on Indiegogo. It is a story about a true hero, and I'll let the art speak for itself today. You're looking at some of the beautiful art from my graphic novel in the background. I'm going to include some new stuff. But I just wanted to say that I love writing this story, and I loved putting this book together. I'm still putting it together. It's a joy to do. I want to be here. This is where I want to be, telling this kind of story and working in this kind of way. It is amazing to do. And I'm trying to capture a certain spirit of heroism and creativity back in the 1980s, when I think the people working for the comic companies actually had that same wonder, that same spirit of, I want to be here and this is what I want to do. So if any of that sounds appealing to you, if the art looks appealing to you, you might want to click on that link in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novel is for you. But in order to do what I want to do, survey the desolation, really, that is current storytelling for science fiction and fantasy, I'm going to go to this year's 2021 New York Comic-Con. Now, usually I do a lot of videos based upon what happens at the Comic-Cons. I've already done one for this year, not the New York Comic-Con, but a smaller one. So I usually look through a lot of the information that's going on during these Comic-Cons. And this year, I actually thought the New York Comic-Con was canceled. I was surprised to find out that it wasn't. I found out when it had already begun. And I started to look for some information at that time. And I went to the usual suspects where I would go to look for the more out-of-the-way information. And something really funny happened. This is a New York City Comic-Con. It is in the backyard of Marvel Comics. Marvel Comics is the big boy on the block for comic publishing within North America. And yet, most of the usual suspects who work for Marvel or have worked for Marvel are radio silent on this. And I didn't see a whole lot put out by Marvel either. And when I went to the New York City Comic-Con social media pages, what did I find? I found post after post after post of things that weren't North American comics, and certainly things that weren't really connected to comics very much at all. You saw North American comics within this string of posts being very marginalized. The concentration, quite honestly, was most notably on anime and manga. And again, some of you might not see that as being terribly surprising, given the success of anime and manga right now. But again, you got to remember, this is New York, the playground of Marvel Comics. And if they're being pushed out in their own territory, in their own hometown, that really says something. But I went on from there, again, to go look at the usual suspects and see what they were saying about the New York City Comic-Con. And one of the most vocal champions for the New York City Comic-Con and the promotion of Marvel Comics within what they call the con season within Marvel Comics would be Sana Amanat. She is the Vice President of Content and Character Development, which is basically a senior position, the second in control, and I would say operationally the first in control of Marvel Comics. Now, I have said for a number of months now that I think she has left Marvel Comics. And I would take this, what I saw, as being a confirmation of this. Not a hard confirmation, but certainly a soft confirmation. Because there was absolutely nothing on her social media about the New York City Comic-Con or any Comic-Con at all. I don't believe she's in New York anymore. I believe she's probably in Los Angeles because she is an executive producer for the new Kamala Khan Miss Marvel show that is coming up on Disney+. So I think she has moved on. But just take that information and stick a pin in it for now. So from there, I went to the person who is usually the second biggest cheerleader for the Comic-Cons. This is a person who works for Marvel and actually is the director of all these little shorts on the internet and the podcasts and everything else that Marvel has been putting out over the last 10 years. You know, the ridiculous stuff that I cover once in a while, like Marvel's cooking shows, or All About Cosplay, or podcasts about the history of females within Marvel. And she is most notably at the Comic-Cons dressed up with cosplay because she loves cosplay. It is her bread and butter. But again, what did I find there? I found absolutely nothing. But I don't usually go to this woman's social media. Her name, I think, is Judy Stevens. So I didn't notice this before. But I noticed this time there was a pinned tweet at the top. And what was this pinned tweet? Well, it was basically a job resume saying, "Will travel for work." And it was posted, I think, November of 2020. So it's been up for a little bit of time now. Now, I do know that she still is working on some projects at Marvel Comics. Some of the podcasts she's still involved in because a recent tweet actually talks about the Women of Marvel podcast starting back up and how she was so excited about doing some of these interviews. But for almost a year now, she has had a job posting up on her social media saying, "Will travel for work. This is what I do." And I found those two things, along with the fact that Marvel is being ignored within the Comic-Con in its own backyard, to be very telling, and to point towards something which I have talked about a number of times. And it is the hiring practices at Marvel. What you see around us today, the desolation of storytelling within Marvel Comics, and really within the rest of the comic industry as well, is a product of about 10 years of the same kind of hiring practices. So from there, I want to bring in some personal experience that I have. So I used to be a freelance researcher. And from what I have seen, the majority of people that work for comic companies right now are freelancers. And although I didn't do anything creative, what I usually did was quasi-legal. Well, no, that sounds bad. More legal adjacent. How's that? So it didn't have anything to do with the creative, but I know the freelance life, and I know it very well. And the thing was that after a while, my freelance work became so time consuming that I said, I'm just going to hire a freelancer myself. I'll hire this person and I'll train them. They'll do the work and I'll just own a company. And that's eventually what happened. I don't have much to do with that anymore, but that's what happened. But the thing is that when I went to hire someone as a freelancer, it was a bit of an eye-opener, although it didn't happen all at once, because I had been working in this field for more than 10 years, and usually the people who work in this field, you all know each other, and you're usually in the same rooms together at least once a day, and you get to hear things and you get to see things, and I have trained other people for other companies and firms and things like that to do similar kinds of research. So I had a feel for what I would get when I tried to hire someone as a freelancer. And here's the thing about being a freelancer. It is a job that has zero security. And the thing about that is that not a lot of people want a job that has zero security. The people who are attracted to this job, usually you could break down into one of two categories. There's person A who says to themselves, I'm looking at this kind of work, and the fact that not many people do this kind of work, and therefore I might be able to make a lot of money doing this. Or I might be able to do this and do it in a very unique way, and so I'll have a lot of time to myself or something of the like. I don't really care that there isn't a whole lot of security. I just want to have these other things that are benefits of being a freelancer. But the second kind of person that you would usually get is the kind of person who would say to themselves, look, I'm looking at this kind of work. I really don't want to do it, but it is a very unique skill set that you can learn when actually going through the process of being a freelancer and learning what freelancers actually do and how they do it. Therefore, I'm going to let them train me. I'll stay for 6 months, maybe a year, maybe a little longer. I'll make sure I have that skill set, then I'll leave, and I'll use that skill set to get a better job, one that has security. Now, I was looking for person number one because I wanted this person to be around 5 years, maybe even 10 years after they actually learned all the things that I had to teach them. Because I don't want to spend a year, maybe even a year and a half training someone to do this work to have them up and leave. Therefore, obviously, I went for type number 1. Now, here's a thing that seems like an aside, but it really isn't. The reason why we have stereotypes is because it's usually a funny way of expressing a general rule. Now, I have gone over and done multiple videos about these comic companies, and we can't push stereotypes anymore. That's wrong. I'm sorry, but there's a reason why we have stereotypes, because it's usually the general norm. And I will tell you that the general norm is that when you're looking for someone who is actually in the type A category, someone who doesn't care about security, you're looking for a male. 95% of the time, when I got people who were applying for this freelance position, I could see very easily that they didn't want to be there. They wanted the experience, and then they would move on once they got that experience and knowledge in order to find a job that had security. So females, typically, I would say 95% of them want security. And honestly, I think that is explained by the nature of being a woman. Quite literally, your body is built to have children, and there is a instinctual drive within people, as within many, many other kinds of animals, especially mammals, to have a security for those children. So that's what women want. If you're looking for males, it's not 95% certainly that want to take that risk. I would say it's probably 75% of people want to take that risk, and 25% of the people, the males, actually want security. So if you're looking for someone who wants to jump in with both feet and doesn't care about security, you're typically looking for a guy. So let's take all of that and add to it a couple of factors about how the producers of stories for science fiction and fantasy actually bring on people to write these kinds of stories. Let's look at the book industry itself first. Now, I'm someone who has written a novel, and I tried to get that novel published. Again, it was probably about 10 years ago. And perhaps it just wasn't a very good novel. My editor thought it was really good and that I should actually pursue getting it published instead of actually trying to self-publish it. But when I went to go and get it published, first I needed an agent. And when I started to look for agents, I recognized some very specific patterns in who agents were and what they were looking for. Number one, I would say about 90 to 95% of the people who are agents for the book companies right now are women. And what were these women looking for? Well, most of the time, at the top of the list, you would see, I'm looking for women's fiction, or for stories about marginalized people. So, the majority of them are heavily progressive females looking for heavily progressive stories. And I soon realized that my story, which is about a male and a very traditional kind of society, was never going to fly with these people. So if you're a novel reader, especially of science fiction and fantasy, and you're wondering, where have all the great storytellers gone, or why are all the great storytellers now being self-published? Well, this is the reason why. Because in order to really get hired, it's not really hiring, but in order to get hired so that you can publish through one of these major companies, you need to go through this gauntlet of feminism and intersectionality. And if you don't play ball, you don't get published. And if you do play ball, your story usually suffers for it. But let's look at something a little more specific. Let's look at Marvel Comics, because there's really good information about what goes on at Marvel Comics and how they hire people. I've done a number of videos about this, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. One of the things that I got confirmed just a couple of weeks ago, from both now a positive and a negative side from Marvel, is the fact that the people who run the companies can no longer look at the material that other people put out, because they're just too scared of getting sued. They don't want to put out a movie 2 years from now and have someone come to them and say, hey, that was part of the script that I gave you to read, therefore you ripped it off from me, therefore you owe me millions of dollars. They're so scared of that happening that they can't have anybody at their companies actually read anything that is produced by others, especially not anything that's produced by others, which are just people trying to get into the industry. This is what Jim Shooter said in that interview that I covered with Jim Shooter a couple of weeks ago. And this is the exact same thing that Sana Amanat talked about a couple of years ago on a podcast that I covered as well. They can't actually look at people's material. So what do? Well, Jim Shooter said the way that they should be attracted to you is if you have success. It's either you actually make a lot of money or you make a lot of fans, and then they'll be attracted to go and talk to you, and that's how you get in. Now, that's a process that is dependent upon merit, and I'm sure during Jim Shooter's time, that was the way it probably worked. But that's no longer the way it works. Again, I have heard over and over again with the Marvel podcasts and the Marvel panels at the Comic-Cons, the question, how do I get to work for Marvel? And they give very specific answers. They say, no, we can't look at your material, but someone can bring it to our attention. Now, the Women of Marvel podcast, by the way, did an entire year's worth of podcast based upon the idea of making allies for yourself. And this is what they do. They depend on their quote-unquote allies to bring to their attention these people that should, in their minds, work for Marvel. Now, is this based upon merit? No, it is not. Why? How do I know this? Because I've heard probably a dozen times the same story over and over again. Well, first of all, you had Sana Amanat saying, we will come and find you if you have a unique voice. And what does unique voice mean? It means if you're a marginalized person of the type that they don't have on staff already. And that is what they are looking for. But again, you hear from the mouths of the people who were hired by Marvel a very specific kind of story. The story usually goes something like this. I was working at my local library or at my comic shop, and I got this call on the phone saying, will you come and work for Marvel? And I said, OMG, you're so mean. Who are you? Why would you do this to me? And then they said, no, really, this is Marvel. We want you to come and work for us. And now I work for Marvel. Honestly, that's the same story you get over and over again. You have these people. They have no success. They admit at that point they were not successful, but they had an ally, and one of their allies took their stuff and gave it to someone at Marvel and said, you should look at this person. Now, what happens after that? Well, Marvel typically goes through their social media, because at one point they said, and don't say anything bad about Marvel on social media. They go through your social media and give you a political purity test to look at whether or not they want you to actually work for them. And then they go and find you and offer you the job. And so, you see, this is not based upon merit. But at the same time, the question then arises, why would they be looking for progressive people? Well, for a number of reasons. Number one, again, this was confirmed by Jim Shooter, saying the companies who own these properties are risk averse to the maximum. They do not want risk of any kind. And at the same time, I covered this a little bit in my video about Masters of the Universe, where I talked about the fact that they don't want actual fans either. Why? Because actual fans actually respect the material and the characters. But these large companies, to them, these are just intellectual properties that they will milk dry through any means necessary. If that means destruction of these characters and these properties, so be it. And if you have actual fans of those properties working on those properties, when you tell them to destroy it, they're going to probably not take that very kindly and might even walk out the door on you. And they don't want that. They want someone who will follow orders. And funny enough, when I did that Masters of the Universe video, I got a couple of people hitting me up and saying, listen to these podcasts here. They're about people who work on the Star Trek shows. They do small things on Star Trek shows, but they say very specifically that in order for them to get into that position, just to get into these small positions to work on these shows, they had to hide the fact, specifically hide the fact that they were fans of Star Trek. Because if they learned that they were fans of Star Trek, they would never get in. So I would say that's a loose confirmation of my hypothesis that they don't want actual fans working on these intellectual properties. But the other thing being about these companies and why they hire progressive people is because, and again, I never knew what the actual term for this was until I listened to Jim Shooter a couple of weeks ago, but I knew exactly what it was. I just didn't have a name for it. It's the fact that these companies are looking to keep a very high Q score for their intellectual properties. A Q score is how well does it resonate within the mind of the normal person? Do they recognize this character? They always want to keep those characters in the minds of people that are in the general public. And it doesn't matter how they get to do this. And I think companies, large companies, have found a very easy way to do this, and that is through rage bait and clickbait. And the way to get to rage bait and clickbait is through hiring progressive people. Now, they don't care about these progressive people nor any of their causes. They might feign like they do, but the companies really don't. They're simply using them as useful idiots. And these people are already being used as useful idiots by political entities. Why not have the corporate entities use them in the same way? And they do. So they have these people. They hire these progressive people. Why? Because these progressive people, well, first of all, they're filled with rage right under the surface anyways. Most of them understand their ideology only through feelings. And again, over and over again, I've done podcasts about higher-ups, vice presidents at Marvel and Disney talking about how it's all about empathy, how it's all about feeling. So you have these people whose feelings are just right under the surface, and you get them to push their narrative, and it pushes people's buttons, and it generates rage bait and clickbait, and that rage bait and clickbait actually works in order to keep the Q score of these intellectual properties very high, which is to say, in the minds of the general public. Why do you think that DC had Superman's son, now the new Superman, come out as being one of these pronoun people? Why? Because New York Times was going to write an article about it, and then it was going to trend on Twitter, and the Q score of Superman would go up even more. And again, they do this because they want to keep the Q score up. They want to keep that character in the minds of the general public so that they can then make money off of that character. Now, I wouldn't say they make money off of the comics in any way, but they do it through movies and television shows and things that are actually out there in the more general populace. So that's why the companies would want progressive people in the positions that handle the very small properties like comics that will keep or help keep the Q score of these intellectual properties, these characters, high within the minds of the general public. Now, the people who are actually quote-unquote progressive, the people who actually get hired to work for Marvel, they are the ones who do believe these quote-unquote progressive talking points, not the people who run the show. But again, let's go back to those hiring practices of Marvel. Once again, the idea of we are looking for unique voices, and that means females and marginalized people. Now, I'll freely admit, if you're a marginalized person, yes, you probably find it hard to do some things. Now, whether or not that's your fault or the fault of something else, I'm not going to talk about that today because that's an entire separate subject. But if you declare yourself to be marginalized, if you declare yourself to be persecuted in some way, you're saying my life is hard. If you're saying my life is hard, then you're generally not going to be someone who actually takes a lot of risks. And add to that the fact that progressive people are typically self-centered. And again, this isn't me talking about it. These are studies that I've gone over in some of my videos that talked about virtue signaling, and how the studies showed that people who were high in virtue signaling were also very high on the scale of being a narcissist or a sociopath or a psychopath, where they wanted people to see them, they wanted attention brought to themselves with very little risk to themselves, or actually not doing any work whatsoever. Because again, they're a sociopath, they're a psychopath, they're a narcissist. So progressive people are very high on that scale. That is to say, people who just look out for themselves. So let's take all of that, and let me add to that fire and say I covered yet another podcast where Marvel was talking to a group of female writers who they lauded as the next great writers of Marvel, and they all talked about the fact that the males that worked for Marvel, especially the older ones, needed to, and these are not my words, these are their words, hold the door open for female and marginalized people so that they could get into Marvel and take over their positions. So, if you look at all of these in combination, what do you get? You get progressive people, marginalized people, women, all of these groups who are typically shy of taking any risk, who are typically looking for nothing but security. And they're being hired by companies who are exactly the same. They are shy of risk. They are looking for security and nothing else. And so, if you take all of that and you add it to my little experience about what you would get when you're trying to hire freelance people, then what is the end result? Especially 10 years into this little experiment, because it was almost 10 years exactly now where Sana Amanat was hired at Marvel specifically through her own words to change both the way comics were made and the entire fan base for Marvel. And she did this through hiring like-minded people and hiring people the exact same way that she was hired. Why? Because someone came and found her, specifically the exact same way. So what do you get? Well, you get people like Sana Amanat who have taken all of the experience that they got working for Marvel and then got out of there as quickly as possible. Now, I would say a lot of people probably wanted to do the same, but not everybody is in the position of Sana Amanat, because Sana Amanat has connections. All these other people do not have connections, so they're stuck. What are her connections? Well, again, I did several videos about the fact that she had connections with both Hollywood and the White House, her brother being a major movie producer, and her cousin, who she grew up in the same house with, being Huma Abedin, who was the right-hand man of the Clintons, especially when Hillary Clinton was working to try to become president, and is still in that position. And by the way, you can see this still if you look at the social media of Sana Amanat. She doesn't tweet very much anymore, but she does tweet about Huma Abedin, and always puts that connection in about my cousin, my relative. Why? Because again, she's trying to play off those connections in order to keep herself into the position, because she's now in Hollywood. She can't use her brother's position in Hollywood anymore, because at this point, he's now in prison, being convicted as a serial swindler. But anyways, the point being that if you had connections, then you can use these mediums like comics, or I would say really anything else, whether it be tabletop gaming or video games, use these as a stepping stone in order to get somewhere else. Just learn the experience and then take it with you to get somewhere where you can have actual security. So you have number one, the people who have moved on. You have number two, the people like Judy Stevens, who, if you remember, I said, if you look at her social media right now, she still works for Marvel, but at the top, pinned at the top of her social media is a job resume saying, I will travel for work. So she wants to get out of there. And she's saying, look, I work for Marvel. Don't you want to hire me? But people are saying, no, we don't. And so she's stuck there. And I'll add to that, you had a whole bunch of people over the last 10 years that Marvel hired that they simply had to get rid of. People like Sina Grace. And he's just top of the list of a number of people where they just got sick and tired of his antics. They used him for what they needed him for rages and clickbait, and then they got rid of him. Got rid of him as a freelancer does. They just simply stop sending you work. That's all they do. So after 10 years of that kind of hiring landscape, what do you got as creative people, especially writers, left at Marvel? Well, you have the dregs. Now, I'll freely admit that some of these dregs actually do have some writing prowess, but at the same time, if all of that I had discussed previously holds, this writing prowess doesn't mean a whole lot when they are ready at any point to put their political ideology above good storytelling. Why? Well, again, I did videos about this, talking about the fact that if you're going to put your political ideology, like quote-unquote progressivism, at the heart of your story, which again, I would say the companies want in order to keep that Q score up, if they want you to do that, you're actually selling an inferior product. Because, and progressives freely admit this, that their entire ideology is socially based and socially constructed, which means you need to have a special skill set of understanding the definitions of how these things actually work. In order to understand such a story, you need to subvert some of your resources in telling the story to actually explaining to the readers what you mean by this progressive story. You have to explain to them in some fashion progressivism first, or at the very least cement it in their mind a little more, because it is not something that is within the nature of a human being just to understand. I would say, and I have many a times, that a normal, actual story, the way that it has been produced and crafted over thousands of years within Western civilization, works upon the nature of human beings and therefore can take 100% of their creative effort and use it towards building a good story. But you can't do that with progressivism being the center of your story, and therefore you have an inferior story, and therefore you have an inferior product. And when you have these people, and they are the ones who are the quote-unquote good writers that keep on getting title after title after title because the people around them are nothing but the dregs left over from everyone else who wants to get out of there or who has gotten out of there, what do you get? Well, again, you get a barren wasteland of storytelling. Now let me give you an example of this. And this is one of the things that triggered all of this in my mind this week. I did a 10-second comic review, which I do on the community section of this YouTube channel, of a Marvel book over the last week. It's called Darkhold Alpha. And when I read it, I set it down and said to myself, I don't read that many Marvel comics anymore, but I can pick out a very specific pattern of what is going on here. These people have a pattern which they're following in order to create a story. It's a story by committee that they have written down, do this, 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 and this, and there's your story. Now, I'm sure there's probably a couple of choices that they can use in order to follow a pattern to write a story, but you're not going to get anything spectacular by any means by following such a pattern. Now, I'll give you this example of Darkhold Alpha. What is this pattern that I saw and have been seeing over a number of years now coming out of Marvel? Well, this specific one was, well, let me tell you about the story really briefly. What you have is Dr. Doom. He uncovers the Darkhold, which is a book of mysticism, which was created by elder gods. And what Doom wants to do with it is to use it to enter into the dark god's territory, his dimension, defeat him, and then take his power. But this goes wrong for him, and then you have other Marvel heroes which have to step in to make sure that this dark god doesn't come to destroy the earth. And so, who do we get stepping in? Well, number one, you get Scarlet Witch, and she brings together a team. A team which everybody in my comments said, this seems like a random team. It does, especially when you're talking about mysticism, but if you look at the pattern that I'm going to set out, you'll see why they chose it. And this team is Spider-Man, Iron Man, the Wasp, Black Bolt from the Inhumans, and Blade. And you add again to them Scarlet Witch. So why would you have such a random group of characters, especially in this book about mysticism, and really none of them have anything to do with mysticism at all, except for maybe Blade? Why? What is the purpose of this story? Well, again, here's the pattern which I have picked out. The way that you write a story for Marvel. What do you do first as your premise? Well, you never come up with anything new. You look into the history of Marvel and you pull something out of there that could have been another story told. And this is exactly what the Darkhold book is. I do believe the origin of that story comes from the Avengers run where John Byrne was working on it, which would be early 80s. And that's a fertile ground, not only because it's great storytelling in that time period, but it's where most of these movie material have their origins coming from. Therefore, go look at that stuff. We might get another movie out of it. And then, once you have this basis of what you're going to create your story around, then you pick a bunch of characters that, again, you want to keep the Q score high within the minds of the people who are in the general public. Or again, reversely, you pick them because their Q scores are a little bit high. That is to say, they are in the minds of the general public and you want to keep it there. And if you look at all these characters, you will see that each one of these characters, excluding Blade, had either a movie or a television show within the MCU over the last couple of years. Now, they've been trying to push Blade over and over again in the comics because they want to rework that. They want a new Blade series in the movies, and they want to make him progressive, by the way. But when I read this book, I'm looking at it going, I see Blade, and Blade is Wesley Snipes in this book. I see Iron Man, and Iron Man is Robert Downey Jr. in this book. Most of the time, he has his armor on, but has no helmet on, so you can see his face. Why? Because he looks like Robert Downey Jr. You can hear the voice of Robert Downey Jr. coming out of his mouth every time he speaks in a word balloon. You have Spider-Man, and Spider-Man acts like Spider-Man does within the movies. Not within the comics, because I would say Spider-Man generally within the comics uses taunting, not with his everyday speech, but his joking, taunting demeanor is used to belittle his opponents to get them off guard. He's actually supposed to be a pretty solid and somber guy when he's in his normal everyday life, or when he's interacting with other heroes. But when you get him making useless jokes when standing around with a bunch of other heroes, to me, that says an MCU Spider-Man, not a Spider-Man from the comics. Certainly not a Spider-Man from the comics that I know, maybe within the last 10 years. But still. Then you have Scarlet Witch, looking ever so much like I think it is, one of those Olsen twins that plays her in the movies? On top of that, you have Black Bolt. And again, Black Bolt is somewhat of an enigma, both within the comics and I would say probably the show. I haven't watched much of the show. But again, he has been within a show, within the MCU, within the last couple of years. So, again, you have all of these characters. These characters are all picked because of their Q score and because you want their Q score to go up. And one of the things I need to point out, I have heard more than once a writer for Marvel Comics saying, I was tasked to write a story, and these were the characters that I was allowed to use. It wasn't I was going to create a story, and then I decided, hey, I should use these characters. It actually fits well with the story, and then go to my editor and say, can I use these characters? Are they being used for anything else right now? That's the old way that comics were written. Not anymore. The company comes to you and says, you need to write a story of this kind. Or you come to the company and say, I want to write a story of this kind. And they give you a handful of characters and say, choose from those. You can use those characters. Why? Again, it's all about the Q score. And once you have that pattern, again, based upon an old idea from popular Marvel Comics, and then you add into that a whole bunch of characters that are recognizable, and again, this is a whole bunch of characters for a reason, not just one, because you want to draw in as many people as possible, because if one person is drawn into this story because they like Black Bolt, then they're going to see all of these other characters as well, and the Q score for those other characters will go up in their mind as well. And once you have that, what do? Well, you take the characters and you subvert them. And this is exactly what happens within this book. At the end of the story, you have the Darkhold book reshaping all of these characters into a dark version of themselves, into a mystic version of themselves, so that they can fight this dark god that they need to fight. And on top of all of that, what do you get? How do you supposedly draw in the reader with stakes for this story when it's just going to be a throwaway story? Well, you do it by making it set upon an apocalypse. Quite specifically, again, this is something I've been going over time after time within these Marvel Comics. They come out with a new issue number 1 of something, and it starts right from the get-go of, there's an apocalypse, it's got to be stopped, or the Earth will be destroyed. It used to be that was the end point. It used to be that was the culmination. It used to be that was the event that would happen maybe once a year or maybe once every couple of years. Now it's almost every book that comes out with a number 1. There's an apocalypse. We need to stop this. You start from the high point, and they supposedly think this is the stakes that's going to engage people. It doesn't. But they hit all of these points, just like a bingo game. Number 1, idea from the past. Number 2, a whole bunch of characters. Number 3, characters that are all in the MCU and that people can recognize. Number 4, you have subversion of the characters in some way. Number 5, you have an apocalypse. There you have the combination, the formula for a Marvel comic. And so if you have this formula and you have all these risk-averse people who don't actually want to rock the boat, then what do? You get these committee stories over and over and over again. And again, this leads to the desolation of storytelling, not just within comics, but within almost every medium of science fiction and fantasy right now. And so again, let's survey the landscape of storytelling for science fiction and fantasy based upon all that I have just spoken about. Overhead, you have the looming clouds of the corporate entities that control these intellectual properties, and in their pursuit to make money, will destroy these properties at their whim. You have the desert landscape of nothing but people who don't want to take risks. You have the sinkholes and the quicksand of hiring marginalized people and all the baggage that comes with them. You have the stinking, festering swamps of people who are there but don't want to be there. They're just using it for something else. And on top of all of that, you have the pestilent fume of progressivism hanging over everything. This is the state of modern storytelling, especially modern science fiction and fantasy storytelling. And really, there's only one way that I can see out of this desolate wasteland. It is to embrace the fact that most of these things we look towards to find great science fiction and fantasy stories, when these great stories first emerged, they were very small. They were subcultures in themselves. We need to embrace that once again. We need to go back to those roots of being a subculture, not part of the culture in general. These are the only oases left of good science fiction and fantasy stories. Or in other words, as you probably already know, the only future for great stories of the kind we're looking for is in the hands of independent creators. So, hopefully I've given you something new to think about. If I did, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, my graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, my attempt at being an independent creator. The link for it is in the description. It is a story about a true hero. It is a story based upon the great method of telling stories that puts the story first, and puts it first for the service of the reader. So if any of that sounds appealing to you at all, you might want to click on that link in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novel is for you. Anyways, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.